Hey everyone, so this is kind of a commentary track, but more like a commentary discussion about the most recent video essay that's on the main channel. It's called The Sad Story of Robert Zemeckis and His Wonderful Toys. For this, my friend David Chen is joining me as like a moderator, and we're going to be discussing some stuff that didn't make it into the video and really talking a lot about expanding on the ideas and topics explored in that video. And so it's like, if you enjoyed that video, this is more like that. And it gets into also the creation of the video and just like how it all came together and what I was trying to do. We're hoping to do more sort of behind the scenes stuff kind of like this on this channel this year, because I don't use this channel enough. And so you should subscribe to get more of this kind of stuff, and also let us know in the comments if you like it and want more, and we'll try to make that happen. So anyway, that's enough of me, on to the video.
Hey everyone, David Chen here, and really pleased to be talking today with Patrick Willems about his latest video on Robert Zemeckis. Patrick, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing really well, David. Thank you for being here and talking to me about this.
I'm excited to be here and really happy to be talking with you about this video because, I love all your videos, but this one I was particularly struck by, and I was like, Patrick, we should try to do some kind of Q&A about this, talk about the making of the video, talk about things you wish you had gotten to in the video but didn't have a chance to. So let's just dive right in, Patrick. When you watch Welcome to Morrowind, you're like, oh, I can see the arc of this person's career, right? Just in this video, and there's enough meat on that bone to make a video. Like, is that what makes you feel like, hey, this is enough? This is worth my time to spend, all this time rewatching these movies and writing something about it.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I do have a long list of just potential video ideas just on my computer, and usually ideas stay on that list for months before I actually decide to commit to them and like put them onto the schedule, or like the calendar of videos. And really, it's like these are usually topics that I'm just interested in and just am thinking about in general. But it takes a while before. What really happens is they just kind of sit in my brain for a long time and just like kind of marinating there, and I just like will think of them now and again. And there has to reach a point where I'll just suddenly get excited about it and like, late one night just go down like a rabbit hole of just researching it online and just digging up interviews with people involved in whatever topic it is. And if it's a topic that I seem to like just already be spending time thinking about and digging into, and then start just monologuing to my friends whenever I'm around them, that's usually when I decide, this is something that I clearly have something to say about, because I won't shut up about it. And now it's time to put it onto the calendar and actually commit to it.
Yeah. I know how you feel, though. It sounds like there needs to be some kind of flash of inspiration to like really dig in to something before you fully commit. That's
exactly it. And like that's part of the reason that I almost never do videos about new movies or like current releases. Mm-hmm. Because I usually have to sit with a topic for like, again, months, having it develop. And usually after I see a movie once, I don't immediately have a whole, like enough of a take to power a 20-minute long video. There are rare examples, like last summer when I did the video on Cats, when only a trailer for Cats was out, which is something that I never normally do.
Right.
But and that was one where there was something totally different on the schedule for that week. And then suddenly just on the subway, this thing came like fully formed to me, just like all of these points and arguments and things I wanted to discuss just about the film Cats, which I would not see for 6 months. But that's very rare. Yeah. Usually it takes a long time for these things to develop into the point where they're ready to like be made into videos.
As you're digging into Robert Zemeckis' filmography, is there anything you found that really surprised you? That you're like, I didn't expect to find that, but I did?
Watching them all together, and especially like knowing that I'm making this video, and I'm looking for like links or recurring elements through all of the films. And so this was a perfect example because I realized like, oh, the best movies that he makes really seem to be these ones where the protagonist drives the whole movie with a very clear, concrete goal, and that they have to develop a complex technical plan to execute, and then I didn't delve into it that much. It was kind of just in a throwaway line in the video, but I did notice that like, oh, wow, so many of Zemeckis's dramas seem to be about ordinary people that become media figures and are then involved in press conferences and are constantly on the news. And I'm like, that like I don't even know what to like if that is saying anything, but it just seems to be a thing that crops up in almost all of his movies. And yeah, those were the immediate things that jumped out at me, just like these funny little recurring things that honestly, they're the kind of things that I imagine like if you asked him about it, like he's never really thought about and like he probably couldn't articulate, but it's like some sort of subconscious thing that like these are topics that interest him, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's interesting how you can learn a little bit more about a filmmaker's interests through themes that recur through their films. But I noticed, Patrick, in your discussion, there are a few movies that didn't make it into the final video. Romancing the Stone, Death Becomes Her, What Lies Beneath. Some of these are like pretty big hits. So curious how you chose the movies to discuss in the video.
I've seen all of the movies before. And so I didn't rewatch Romancing the Stone because that was kind of his only like work for hire directing job. Because he was coming off of I Want to Hold Your Hand and Used Cars, which both flopped at the box office, and he wrote 1941, which was Spielberg's first failure, and then Romancing the Stone was really just like a kind of like work for hire, just directing job. He didn't write it, and of course it is like a pivotal movie to his career because then it gave him the clout to be able to make Back to the Future. In terms of him as his identity as a filmmaker, I didn't feel like it was really essential to that. It was more kind of just like him proving, oh, look, I can direct. Like, not that I have like a clear voice, but I can direct a mainstream movie. Right. And then Death Becomes Her, which is a movie that I saw years ago and enjoyed. It is kind of this weird like curio in his filmography because it comes right in between the Back to the Future trilogy and then before Forrest Gump, and it's kind of the end of his 80s period. But again, like I didn't feel like that added a whole lot to the conversation other than, oh, he made a mainstream comedy that's a little bit more adult oriented that also has cutting edge visual effects. And other than that aspect, like, oh, there are, cutting edge visual effects in there. I didn't feel like it really added a whole lot. And I did actually rewatch What Lies Beneath. And I just had pretty much nothing to say about it. I don't think it's especially good. I don't think it's all that interesting other than like, oh, remember a time when Hollywood would actually make big budget horror movies? But yeah, for me, like watching it again, it really just kind of felt like a movie that he made to just fill the time while he was waiting for Tom Hanks to lose weight and they could resume Castaway again. There's one shot in What Lies Beneath that is like a sort of showy kind of classic Zemeckis like magic trick shot. But other than that shot, nothing stood out to me that like needed to be included in the video.
It's interesting. I mean, I think people watch your videos and they feel like, oh, these are so comprehensive. Like, how could you leave out blank? But really, you're trying to make a pretty specific argument in the video, and you're only going to include things that are going to support that, right?
Right, exactly. I don't need to waste the audience's time just being like, and so now let me just give you my thoughts on What
Right.
Lies Beneath that have nothing to do with anything else, just to prove that I watched it. So I didn't need to do that.
Let's talk a little bit about Forrest Gump, one of his biggest hits. This is a movie that it seems like it flummoxed you when you watched it, right? And you bring up a few things about the movie that I really appreciate. First of all, I had actually already made the Frank Grimes connection myself a long time ago of like that the Frank Grimes episode of The Simpsons and Forrest Gump are both pieces of art that feature people kind of getting through life and being wildly successful without really trying that hard. I mean, they do work hard, but
Right.
there's not as much intentionality behind their decisions as other people, right?
Yeah, it's kind of accidental success.
I have to say, when I first saw the Frank Grimes episode of The Simpsons, it really upset me on a deep level because, I think like the Frank Grimes episode of The Simpsons is all about who you identify with in that episode, right? Do you identify more with Frank Grimes or Homer Simpson? And I wasn't smart enough at the time to understand that it was a kind of this meta commentary on The Simpsons itself, right? Mm-hmm. And now I realize, oh yeah, they're saying that it's ridiculous that Homer Simpson has done all this stuff. It did treat Frank Grimes very cruelly, however, I think.
I mean, people have argued that that while that's a great episode, that is kind of like. I think there's an article, it might be on, it's either The Verge or Polygon, but where that is like the great episode of The Simpsons that is also when it jumped the shark, and that it could never really be the same after that. I've always thought of the Armand Tamzarian episode from season 9 as the shark jumping moment.
Agreed. I agree completely. Yeah.
Cool, but I totally buy how the Frank Grimes one kind of is that, because again, it's very self-aware. And it also brings in, a new character to point out how weird the show is, and then is very cruel toward him.
When you look at Forrest Gump today, it is kind of this odd movie to think about as being as wildly successful as it was. You know what I mean? Like, when you think of what are the themes of this movie that resonated so much with people back then, what caused it to be not just a commercial success, but also a critical success? It's a little bit confusing, especially when you break down the themes as you do in the video of, hey, Forrest Gump basically does what people tell him to do, and he's wildly successful. And the rebel, Jenny, right, she ends up having a pretty rough life. With the benefit of hindsight, it feels like a movie that is about the pleasures of conformity. I mean, a lot of people enjoy conformity as a concept, whether they do so intentionally or not. And I think the idea that you can just coast and kind of do your thing and, be buffeted by the winds of society and end up wildly successful, that feels like a dream. That feels almost aspirational, What do you think of that?
I believe that. That makes sense. Because what I was thinking a lot about also while rewatching it and then considering how successful it was, it's like this is a movie that came out in 94. Okay, so this is like, it's America in the 90s. It's like Clinton's first term. Things like, again, I was a young child at the time, so I wasn't really aware of how things were, but from what I have heard and read since then, that felt like a pretty like cozy, right, like comfortable, confident era in America. And I get why this movie that is kind of like a like greatest hits reel of America in the 20th century played so well. I mean, it is kind of like a movie designed for like to make like boomers feel good.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
like it's basically like, hey, wasn't America great? And by the way, like, if you're just chilling out and doing your thing, America can be awesome for you as well. Like that's essentially what the movie is, in my opinion, right? It's like, hey,
yeah,
just, without even trying that hard, you can end up having a pretty good life. And there's something very comforting about that idea.
Right. And also, just the idea of presenting this protagonist who's like simple but nice and like, and means well.
Yeah.
And it's again, it feels like, I mean, it is a movie made in and made for a different era. And I think what you're saying about the pleasures of conformity could very well be what Zemeckis and Eric Roth, who wrote it, were aiming for. The thing that I was getting into in the video was just how, like, regardless of what their intent was, there is just this other subtext there, and there are a lot of other things present that I just think are very strange. The fact that some aspects seem satirical, some are very sincere. And I was reading more about the book that it's based on. And I think it's one of those things where, like, I had completely forgotten it was based on a book.
Same.
I never hear anyone talk about the book. And I didn't realize that apparently the book is far more, it's just like a straight satire. And Forrest is apparently a colder, less likable protagonist.
Yeah.
And it feels like like the book feels very cynical just based on what I read about it and the stuff that's in the book that was changed in the movie. And And so that also makes me even more curious about it. It's like, okay, so they took this like cynical, satirical book, but then changed it into this very sincere, like heartwarming film.
Yeah.
And again, I mean, I'm not going to do it, but this is like, I would love to. I hope someone just makes a video about Forrest Gump and digs into all this stuff.
Yeah.
Because I think it's most of the most popular movies ever made, you can look at them and go like, oh, I get why that was so big.
Mm-hmm.
And this one, like, I get why it was successful, but the fact that, but I don't entirely get why it is still one of the most popular movies ever made.
You know, there's one other thing that this conversation raises about Forrest Gump, which I think is the idea that, like, the character of Forrest Gump and his whole arc, it seems to basically imply good intentions are enough. I like the distinction you drew between him and Paddington, right? Because there's something about Paddington that, like, the Paddington movies are really elevating this idea of being a good person, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if you be a good person, everything's going to work out. That is present in Forrest Gump, that sensibility, but to a much lesser extent. It's not even like if you're a good person. It's just like if you have good intentions, vaguely, then like things will be okay and probably actually extremely good. And real life has borne out that like that's not true, right? That like you need more than just good intentions, and but there's something comforting about the idea that hey, maybe just good intentions is enough. So I don't know. I think that it has a rather troubling message, but I feel like the message is pretty clear. At least after, like, your video kind of helped me focus, like, oh yeah, that is what that movie is saying, you know?
Right.
Before we move on to some of his later works, I did just want to ask you about this idea of the Uncanny Valley, right? And, you know, after Forrest Gump, right, like Robert Zemeckis starts making all these movies that are just all complete, you know, digital and CG, you know, motion capture. And many of them don't look very good today. And they look...
I mean, I think the question is, did they even look good at the time?
Yeah.
Because I remember when those were coming out, and even then, so much of the response was, I remember I didn't see Polar Express in theaters because so many of the reviews that I read and just looking at the trailers, I was like, the people just look weird.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I will say this. Haven't seen Polar Express yet. I did see Beowulf in IMAX. And at the time, I did feel like, I can actually remember how I felt watching Beowulf. It was, this looks pretty good, but is still unconvincing. Is how I felt that was at the time.
I didn't see it in IMAX. I did see it in theaters in 3D. In like the pre-Avatar 3D landscape.
Yeah.
And at the time I remember being like mixed to positive on it.
Yeah.
And I think I was about feeling the same way. Like, okay, it's closer.
Yeah.
But
this is
also
probably as good as we can do right now. Is how I felt about it.
Right.
Yeah.
I could have spent way more time in the video talking about this, but for instance, like Grendel, played by Crispin Glover in it, still looks great. And you know why? Because he doesn't look like a human.
He's not. They're not trying to make him photorealistic, right? A photorealistic human, I should say. He's like a fantastical creature in the movie. Right.
Yeah, and like the design is good, the lighting on him is good, the movement is good. I have no problem with him. It's just everyone else.
One of the things that I think is interesting to reflect back on is what is it that makes movie digital effects feel and look timeless. You know, you talked about Who Framed Roger Rabbit in your video, and a lot of those effects still hold up today. I mean, that movie still looks great.
Yeah.
But, you know, we think of like Polar Express, we think of Beowulf, and like even if you look at early Pixar work, right, or early DreamWorks stuff, like How to Train Your Dragon 1 or Toy Story 1, like a lot of it does look very crude and primitive to today's eyes, right? And so I guess I'm curious if you have any thoughts on like what is it that makes something feel more timeless than other things. I'll just give one example before I throw it to you about this, which is that I think one of the best examples of creating digital effects that age very well would be Darren Aronofsky's The Fountain. Did you see that movie?
Yes, I saw it once. over a decade ago.
Yeah,
So it's not fresh in my mind.
I love that movie, but I think like one of the things he did when he was making that movie was the special effects of like the wormhole or in space or whatever. Like he used microscopic cameras or whatever to film like cells dividing and things like that. And he knew that just capturing actual biological processes and doing so in a way that was vivid would be something that could stand the test of time. You know, because there's something like naturalistic about it that, in my opinion, ages very well. So that's an example of like effects that have aged really well. Who Framed Roger Rabbit, another example of effects that have aged really well. Effects that didn't age well, you know, we think of like Beowulf and Polar Express and other things of that ilk. But curious, like, you know, what you think about, like, was there a way he could have done it that might have looked different? Like maybe, like as you bring up in your movie, exaggerate all the features. Don't make them try to look photorealistic humans, you know, like make them more like The Incredibles, highly stylized.
I would not call myself an expert on visual effects or animation. I just am a person who thinks about them a lot and is interested in them. I mean, I really think in terms of things being dated, so much of that just comes from how much they are aiming for realism. Like I think the reason Roger Rabbit still looks great is because all of the effects there are really hand-drawn 2D animation. And 2D animation, which is basically its own medium and is so far from what we consider realism, like almost no hand-drawn animation is dated. I mean, you can look at like a Disney movie from the 40s seems so much more timeless than even like a live action movie from the 40s.
You know what I just realized? Like, probably a part of it is that is a medium that had kind of reached maturity already. You know, like that the drawings from the 40s look very similar to the drawings from the 60s and the 80s. You know, like that there had already been many years of people doing hand drawn animation by the time you get to, you know, more recent films, whereas we are still right now, as we speak, in the middle of evolving digital technology in movies, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I do think even with, CG animation, I think by the nature of that having textures and existing in like a three-dimensional plane, that is a step more, more toward realism than hand-drawn animation is. And I think that's part of why, we can tell that things are dated because like textures don't seem right. And our like lighting doesn't seem right because these are things that it's trying to like replicate these things that exist in the real world in a way that hand-drawn animation isn't. I think Pixar was extremely smart when they made Toy Story because they picked to make their first feature-length CG animated movie, a movie where everyone is plastic anyway, because everything looks like plastic. And then I think part of the DreamWorks problem in some early DreamWorks movies, like Shrek doesn't look as good as it did at the time. Like that is really dated now because they were trying to have like realistic looking humans with like regular proportions and stuff like that. And that is the stuff that looks the most dated. The closer they're trying to get to like full photorealism, the more rapidly it ages.
Yeah.
And that's what you run into in the Zemeckis stuff. I don't get it. I guess he just loves this aesthetic, but he keeps chasing this look where it's like he really, I mean, again, I could be wrong. I couldn't find an interview where he said this, but it really seems as if he's trying to reach a point where he just can make movies that seem live action, but that are totally created in a computer.
Yeah.
Like he doesn't seem so much interested in like animation and what animation can do. And he just wants to like kind of fake live action. And like, why would you make an animated movie starring Anthony Hopkins where he's just digital Anthony Hopkins looking exactly like he does in real life? Like, what's the point of that? Why spend all this time like animating, like the shirt that he's wearing when you could just film him and it would look like the same thing. I don't get it.
Well, I think your video answers the question, right? Which is that you want to you want to have him fighting like Ray Winstone, right? Is Beowulf, right? You want to have him fighting that big monster, and it makes it more sense if they all look of a piece. Then you don't need to actually go out into the middle of the ocean or wherever the hell they shot that part or animated that part, and there's just a lot of production realities that get in the way of telling the story exactly the way you want to. And if they had shot it using live action, then the stuff that was digital would have even stood out even more, perhaps.
I don't know. It's weird because that movie came out in 2007, and it cost like $200 million.
Yeah.
It's not like he had a limited budget. I'm like, the set pieces and the stuff that they're trying to do, it's no more complicated than what was already done in like Lord of the Rings and like what Peter Jackson had just done in like King Kong 2 years earlier. Like this can be done in live action. You're not trying to do these impossible things. I mean, really, I will say the one thing I'll say for Beowulf is the one aspect of the motion capture that makes sense to me is Ray Winstone, because he in real life does not look anything like Beowulf in that movie.
Right.
And Ray Winstone,
just to be clear, like Beowulf is super jacked in the movie, and
he looks like Chris Hemsworth.
Yes, and Ray Winstone in real life does not look like that.
No, Ray Winstone, he's like an aging, kind of doughy British gangster guy.
Yeah, super talented, just not a Beowulf-esque person, right?
Exactly. No, I mean, as we all know, Ray Winstone he's a growl tiger in real life.
But here's the thing. Yes, it's possible to achieve all those things using live action, but obviously the promise of being able to control every aspect was very intoxicating, right? And things go wrong on live action sets all the time. I'm sure you realize this shooting your own videos, right? Like things that you intend, right? It doesn't go right. So he's like, hey, I want to control everything. And hey, if it doesn't look quite photorealistic, whatever, we count it as the cost of doing business until it becomes photorealistic, which this movie that I'm making will help it to become one day. At least that's kind of my mental narrative of how Robert Zemeckis thinks.
Exactly. I really think that's it. It's the thing that I find funny, and I touched on this in the video briefly with when I talked about Peter Jackson. And originally there was a longer section there using other filmmakers as examples, but every so often there are these filmmakers who kind of, I guess, decide that it's on them to advance filmmaking technology. Like Ang Lee is in the same spot right now, where he's so obsessed with high frame rate stuff, and he's like, I have to, because I am the guy who's obsessed with this, I have to perfect it for future generations of filmmakers, and that is my purpose now. It's not just to make good, compelling movies. I have to move technology forward. And that to me is really strange. I almost always find it disappointing because it's usually filmmakers whose work I've liked a lot who just lose themselves, in this world of just becoming obsessed with the technology.
I think there is this idea of in its final form, digital technology will be photorealistic. HFR will make it feel like we're looking through a window rather than looking at a screen. That I feel like these filmmakers, Robert Zemeckis, Ang Lee, whoever else, Peter Jackson, right?
Jon Favreau's kind of getting into that territory now.
Jon Favreau, James Cameron, whoever you wanna name, I feel like they can see what the final vision is going to be for these technologies, and they also have the resources and the clout to try to get this technology there. And I can kind of first of all, I think that you're probably right that they do feel it's on them, quote unquote. But at the same time, I actually, from reading these things, reading interviews and watching interviews, I feel like these filmmakers genuinely enjoy the technology. It's not just I'm doing it because I have to, it's this huge burden and cross to bear. I feel like they actually think that it leads to better storytelling, right? And so that's why they do it. So it's not just a responsibility. It's also something they're very passionate about. But also, it feels to me like they do see if this thing was perfect, it would blow everyone's mind. And the tragedy comes in the gulf between the perfect version of it and what ends up on the screen. Right.
Yeah.
And like that's what you see with like movies like Beowulf and Polar Express is like, and even Gemini Man is that like, hey, I understood kind of what you were going for, but what ended up happening didn't quite get us there. And Robert Zemeckis has been lucky actually because he's gotten many bites of the apple in terms of like trying to make this work. And the most recent one of those is Welcome to Morrowind, but. Before we get to that, let's just like make sure like this was originally a longer section about these other filmmakers like Peter Jackson and Ang Lee, and like was there anyone else, and like what other conclusions did you come to about these filmmakers and the technology that they're kind of trying to pioneer?
It really kind of it talked about Peter Jackson as it does in the current video, and then it went into talking about Ang Lee, and I know I had a quote from, there was an interview he did with Matt Patches at Polygon last fall when Gemini Man was coming out, talking about high frame rate stuff. And he had a line about how, because he became so obsessed with it, he couldn't, like he had a hard time watching regular movies because that weren't in high frame rate. And I just mostly felt bad for him. It felt like this obsession with the technology was actually like hurting his enjoyment of the medium he had like dedicated his life to. And the thing with Ang Lee that I find really interesting and kind of tragic is that almost no one in terms of audiences seems to be on or share his opinion or be on the same page that he is when it comes to high frame rate. Like he is so dedicated to this thing and no one is with him. I feel for the guy. It's got to be rough. Just, believing so strongly in a thing. And I mean, if the box office and reviews of Billy Lynn and Gemini Man are any indication, no one else is very enthusiastic about it. And so like, I don't know what he's going to do next. And the thing is, really the first guy that this happened to was George Lucas, with the Star Wars prequels. I mean, I think it's a similar thing to Zemeckis. Like Zemeckis wanted all the control and didn't want to have to deal with just like the general problems that arise with the film production, and so cut them all out by doing it all at a computer. And George Lucas is a guy who never really liked directing very much and didn't really like working with actors or, just dealing with the reality of filmmaking. And so the idea of being able to just do more of it in a computer, I imagine just like for him, like he just kind of stepped further and further away from the real world and just more and more into a computer. And I'm really struggling to think of examples where these types of things have led to better movies. I mean, there are times where I guess the technology that they've developed or advanced can then be used well on movies like several years later by other people. But usually it just leads to kind of like the worst movies in these filmmakers' careers.
Where the technology feels like it comes before the storytelling, right?
Exactly.
I mean, another filmmaker that comes to mind, by the way, is Michael Mann, who has used kind of digital filmmaking technology to varying levels of effectiveness. The most prominent one being like Public Enemies, right? Where he shot that on something that looked very digital video.
It did.
I remember listening to like a Film Spotting episode about that, and I think it was Adam Kempenar on Film Spotting said like, this is the guy who made Last of the Mohicans, right? Like he knows what good movies are supposed to look like.
Right.
And it just really struck me that when he said that, because I'm like, I thought Public Enemies looked really bad. I did not think that the aesthetic fit the story I was trying to tell. But these are filmmakers that have made some of the best movies of all time that like where the technology then becomes so intoxicating that they are unable to see what the technology, it's almost like they can't see what other people see the technology as.
Right.
Like maybe part of that is they feel like this responsibility, like, hey, they have to make it work. They have to make it mainstream.
Michael Mann is an interesting example because he's a guy who doesn't make movies that are heavy on visual effects or that are like made within computers like these other guys. His thing, it really felt like the appeal for him of just digital cinema cameras This really came from changing the way he could work on set. In a way, I guess this is kind of similar to Ang Lee and his idea of high frame rate, making things like looking through a window into another reality. Because like with Michael Mann, you know, he kind of like he pulls away traditional movie lighting. And it's like, oh, we can just basically shoot in like pitch blackness, and it becomes kind of like this documentary aesthetic of just filming like the real world, like how it is.
Right.
It is a similar thing. It's like it's different toys that he became obsessed with, and he's like chasing some idea of like reproducing reality on screen that, again, most audiences did not really vibe with.
Yeah.
And now we of course we're all wondering if he will make a movie again.
There's one last thing before we move on, Patrick, that I want to mention, which is you were talking about how George Lucas has not really been into the act of filmmaking, and I just need to point out that filmmaking is a slog. You know, like physically, it's brutal. You know, you're going to set super early in the morning, or you're often staying super late at night. You know, you're doing like 12, 16-hour days. Often you're filming in punishing climate conditions. You know, much of Star Wars filmed in the desert. And if you give someone the opportunity to say like, hey, guess what? We have this technology so that you don't need to do that anymore. You know, most people I think would take it. You know what I mean? Like, so
I get it.
I think it's a very reasonable set of trade-offs for someone to make. And of course, people such as you and I can have our opinion on how successful a trade-off is, but I do just want to acknowledge that, like, I think it's coming from this place of, hey, not only can this theoretically lead to a better product, but also you need to work a lot less, at least when it comes to like physically going to a on-location shoot or whatever.
Right.
So how are you feeling about Pinocchio? Is this like, we should say digital technology, CG, has continued to improve, right? We've now seen people can be de-aged in movies extremely convincingly, you know?
Yeah.
We are way beyond where we were during Polar Express. So is this the movie? I mean, we're at Welcome to Marwen levels, right?
I will say, I didn't say this in the video, but the mocap in Welcome to Marwen, I think, again, because the characters are all plastic dolls, it avoids the Uncanny Valley. It is not nearly as unpleasant to look at as his other mocap movies. It actually, like, that stuff, even while I think it was a bad idea to have half the movie be and like an action movie about dolls, it doesn't look bad.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. So it's almost like his dream and his vision has been achieved. However, movie itself was pretty rough, right?
Yes, I would not call Welcome to Marwen a good film. I do think it is a weird movie that I kind of want people to see, just so we can talk about how weird it is.
Do you have any theories, like, what went wrong here? I mean, I think the thesis of your video is basically Robert Zemeckis got too obsessed with the toys, and like that's how the storytelling suffered. But like, you and I both know that filmmaking is the result of hundreds or thousands of decisions that get made by many different people. And I don't know, it feels like something else or some other series of events had to be responsible for something like Welcome to Marwen, you know? Like, it almost feels like Welcome to Marwen to me almost feels like a Cats scenario where this is something that's so singularly bizarre and awful. Like, it defies easy explanation.
Cats is a really good comparison, and I actually thought of that while watching the movie. That, again, this is it's a director who can pretty much make exactly what they want to make, really committing to just an inherently bad idea and creating something deeply weird. Again, this past decade of Zemeckis' career is just strange because he returns to adult dramas, but also just seems to be choosing movies strangely, and also like the kind of adult dramas that he wants to make are not the kind of like box office draw they were in the 90s. And so I don't really know. Marwen does seem like this odd fusion of Forrest Gump and his mocap period, where it's like obsessed with the toys, but it's also aiming to be this very sincere, heartwarming movie. And some people also asked why I didn't talk about this. His next movie is not actually Pinocchio. It actually, I think it comes out later this year. Do you know about this? It's an adaptation of Roald Dahl's The Witches.
Oh yeah.
With Anne Hathaway as the Grand High Witch, and that is for Warner Brothers, I believe. This is one that I mean, I'll probably go see it, especially at this point. I'm so committed to Zemeckis. It's like, look, I've got to complete it and see everything he makes. That was my favorite book from childhood. I was a big Roald Dahl fan, and that was my favorite Roald Dahl book. And I have very little confidence that I don't think Zemeckis was ever the right guy to make this movie. Do you remember, like, have you read The Witches or seen the Nicholas Roeg film from 1990?
I believe I have, yeah. The 1990 one, yeah.
Yeah, so you know the scene which traumatized me as a kid where Angelica Houston takes off her mask and reveals, I think it's Rick Baker did the makeup, and this like grotesque, horrifying like creature underneath.
Yep. I can imagine that, yep.
And I can only expect that it's going to be like a fully digital witch.
Right.
Like I will be shocked if he actually goes the makeup route. Because I just assume he's going to fill it with weird digital toys, and then the scenes where the kid turns into a mouse, it's just going to turn into these like fully animated scenes where the mouse is just like running through like the passageways, like through the walls of the hotel or whatever. And yeah, I really just like, I would not be surprised if the rest of his career now is making these kinds of like big studio family movies that give him the budgets and the opportunities to just do as much fully digital as possible.
I try to give these filmmakers the benefit of the doubt, and I think that at the very least, with his next movies, we're going to see some interesting experimentation with technology. I mean, say what you will about Gemini Man, but it's like Ang Lee's really going for it in that movie, right? Like he is trying something, and I may not be a fan of that something, but I appreciate that he's trying it, and that's kind of how I feel about Zemeckis as well. So
I was there for Gemini Man opening night, feeling the same way as you.
Yeah.
And while I didn't see Marwen in theaters, now after having spent all this time just like doing such a deep dive into Zemeckis, I'm invested. And I'm going to see The Witches in theaters. I'm going to see Pinocchio in theaters. And as much as I am not optimistic, I would love nothing more than to have him deliver a spectacular comeback.
All right. Well,
it would make me so happy.
I think that's a great place to end the video. But hey, hope if you are watching this that you've been enjoying this conversation with me and Patrick. If you want to know who I am, again, I'm David Chen. I make YouTube videos as well under the username @DaveChensky. That's Dave Chen SKY. Check it out for video reviews and things of that sort. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. Patrick, anything else you want to say before we wrap up today?
I don't think so. David, thank you so much for just talking with me about this. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Same. It's been a pleasure. And, let us know in the comments, I guess, if you want to see more conversations like this. We'll take a cue from there very strongly, I think. So
yes, that sounds great.
All right. Until then, see you in the next one.
All right. Bye, everyone.